Japan is grappling with a persistent inflation, a shift from its long-standing battle with deflation.
貧困にもっともっとなっていく人がいる中で
Alright, moving on, Japan's core inflation rose in March, adding pressure on the Bank of Japan.
Japan's inflation has hit its highest levels in 40 years.
The hidden crisis destroying Japan's economy. In 1989, Tokyo's Nikkei 225 stock market hit a record 39,000 points, surpassing the combined stock market of the US, Canada, and the UK. The land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was valued higher than all of California. Japan rapidly became the second largest economy on Earth, and it looked like nothing could stop the rising star. And now, in 2025, Japan's economy seems to be struggling. The average wage in Japan has not returned to what it was in the 90s. What happened to the once world's economic powerhouse? What are the hidden crises destroying Japan's economy? Japan's post-war comeback is often described as a miracle. After surrendering in 1945 to the Allied powers, the country was in total ruins.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
Its cities were bombed, industries were destroyed, and many Japanese faced real hunger and poverty. But what followed in the late 1950s and 60s was astonishing. With the strong backing from the United States, which wanted to keep Japan from falling to communism, and a new constitution that limited what its military could spend, Japan could pour its scarce resources into rebuilding its economy. By the early 1980s, Japan had become a global economic powerhouse. In 1995, it overtook West Germany as the world's second largest economy and came right behind the United States. The Japanese economic model became a topic of envy all across the world. Its cars, electronics, and manufacturing quality were unmatched, and brands such as Toyota, Sony, and Panasonic became household names far beyond Asia. Between 1970 and 1980, Japan's GDP grew at an average of over 9% a year, and by 1989, the Tokyo Stock Exchange's Nikkei 225 index reached an all-time high of 38,957 points, nearly double what it had been just 3 years earlier. The total value of Japan's stock exchange made up more than 45% of global equity markets at the time. The value of real estate was even more astonishing. At the boom's peak, land properties in the Ginza district of Tokyo were selling for over $230,000. But underneath, something dangerous was boiling. Fueled by speculative euphoria and encouraged by years of ultra-low interest rates, many Japanese companies and investors started pouring money into stocks and real estate, not because they believed in the fundamentals, but because prices kept increasing. It was a classic asset bubble, and like all bubbles, it burst. In December 1989, the Nikkei was at its peak, but what followed was a crash that erased trillions of dollars in value from the market. By 1992, the Nikkei dropped drastically by more than 60%, falling below 15,000 points. At the same time, real estate prices began to collapse too, wiping out around $3 trillion in value by the mid-1990s. What caused such a dramatic shift? Was it just a market correction or something deeper? Japan's economic bubble bursting didn't hit investors and homeowners, it broke the core of its financial system. When the crash came, many banks in Japan were left holding massive amounts of bad loans, which had been given out during the boom years with little concern for risk. Many of these loans were backed by real estate or stocks now worth a fraction of their original value. In other words, the collateral was gone, but the debt remains. What happened next would shape Japan's economy for decades. Instead of allowing the banks to collapse and writing off the bad loans, the government made a crucial decision. It kept the banks alive. These struggling institutions became known as zombie banks, which means they were technically alive but no longer functioning like real banks. They stopped lending to new or innovative businesses. Instead, they used whatever capital they had to keep their bad loans while rolling over debt and supporting companies that were already failing. This created a chain reaction of inefficiency. In other words, zombie banks funded zombie businesses that could no longer compete or grow, but were kept alive by cheap loans and political connections. By 1997, the problem had become so bad that Japan faced a full-blown banking crisis. Two major institutions, Hokkaido Takushoku Bank and Yamaichi Securities, collapsed to the surprise of many. Still, It wasn't until nearly a full decade after the bubble burst in 1999 that Japan finally injected public funds into most of its banks to stabilize them. By the early 2000s, non-performing loans accounted for nearly 2% of Japan's GDP. And even after bailout efforts, banks were still reluctant to give money to risky new ventures or small businesses, which means that innovation was kept in check. However, one may ask, why didn't Japan act faster? A big reason lies in how its political landscape was structured. The close ties between banks, big corporations, and government ministries created a system where failure was not accepted. Politicians in Japan feared public backlash over any mass declaration of bankruptcies. Regulators were too lenient with the institutions they were meant to oversee, while many executives simply refused to admit that the boom was finally over. This refusal to confront its reality kept Japan stuck, as monetary capital that should have gone to new industries such as tech startups or green energy was trapped inside firms that had lost their competitive edge. This brought consumer confidence to an all-time low, and the banks stayed cautious even long after the immediate crisis had passed. That raises a troubling question. What happens when a country's financial system survives a crisis but never truly recovers? A broken growth model. After the crash of the early 1990s, Japan faced more than just a banking problem. The country stared at an economy that no longer responded to the tools that once made it the world's admiration. Policymakers did all they could to restart the country's growth using familiar methods: lower interest rates, increased government spending, and printing more money. However, the results were frustrating as the Japanese economy refused to wake up. One of Japan's most persistent economic challenges was the steady decline in consumer prices. Unlike inflation, which reduces the value of money over time, deflation encourages people and businesses to delay spending, hoping that prices will drop even further. In Japan, this has been a major drag on growth, and since 1995, consumer prices have remained mostly flat or falling. In fact, Japan has had more than 20 years of near zero or negative inflation, which made it nearly impossible for businesses to plan confidently or for wages to grow sustainably. To combat this, the Bank of Japan began slashing its interest rates. By 1995, Japan's official interest rate was reduced to 0.5% by the Bank of Japan, and by 1999, it dropped to zero. But even that wasn't enough. When traditional interest rate cuts failed, Japan turned to a more radical strategy: quantitative easing. The idea was to inject money directly into the financial system by purchasing government bonds and other assets, hoping to stimulate more lending and spending. In 2001, Japan became the first top economy to use QE. This was 7 years before the US Federal Reserve would adopt the same method during the 2008 financial crisis. The Bank of Japan expanded its balance sheet and pushed more liquidity into the economy. However, unlike the US or Europe, Japan's version of QE had limited impact. This was because the money pumped into the system stayed trapped in banks, which were still reluctant to lend. Households and businesses, already used to decades of deflation and stagnation, were not eager to borrow or invest. Even when inflation briefly ticked up in the mid-2000s, it quickly fell back. In 2013, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe launched a bold new strategy known as Abenomics. This attempted to jumpstart the economy through three pillars: aggressive monetary easing, flexible fiscal policy, and structural reforms. The Bank of Japan under Governor Haruhiko Kuroda doubled down on QE and later introduced negative interest rates in 2016, making Japan the first Asian country to adopt such a policy. Yet again, the results were underwhelming as inflation remained below the 2% target and GDP growth hovered between 0.5% and 1.5% annually for several years. The issue wasn't just about how much money the government was spending, but where it was being spent. Japan's fiscal policy, particularly during the 1990s and early 2000s, was heavily focused on public works. The Japanese government launched several stimulus packages while pouring funds into infrastructure projects. However, much of this money was used inappropriately as rural areas were often prioritized over urban centers for political reasons. Roads, bridges, and dams were built in remote regions with little economic activity. This kind of spending earned the nickname Bridges to Nowhere and did little to support the productivity or innovation of Japan over time. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and other economic hubs, where the most modern infrastructure was needed, received far less attention. In the 1990s alone, Japan announced over 6 stimulus packages, which cost approximately hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet these moves failed to pull the economy out of its slump. Instead, they increased the national debt to GDP ratio, which by 2024 stood at more than 227%. So what happens when all the old tricks no longer work? At the heart of Japan's corporate landscape is the Iron Triangle, the strong and often opaque relationship between big business, government ministries, and the financial sector. This structure was essential during the post-war recovery phase, allowing emerging companies to grow with government support alongside long-term planning. But over time, it created a system of crony capitalism, where innovation and competition were now discouraged in favor of loyalty, hierarchy, and stability. This setup discouraged risk-taking and rewarded conformity. As a result, many of Japan's largest corporations became stagnant. While the world moved rapidly into the digital age, many Japanese firms remained stuck in their old industry style or failed to modernize. The country's workplace culture also contributed to the problem. In Japan, age and seniority often matter more than performance. To this effect, employees are expected to stay with the same company for most of their lives while slowly climbing the ranks over decades. Promotions at the office were based on age and loyalty rather than results, creating a slow-moving, bureaucratic workforce that resisted change. New ideas were often seen as disruptive, and younger employees rarely challenged their superiors. One of the most well-known aspects of Japanese work culture is the emphasis on long hours and face time at work. It's common for employees to stay late, not because they have more work, but because leaving before the boss is seen as disrespectful. According to OECD 2023 data, Japan ranked 29th out of 38 developed countries regarding labor productivity per hour worked. This culture has been counterproductive to entrepreneurship, as startups face tough barriers such as difficulty securing funding, lack of support networks, and societal stigma against failure. As a result, Japan has lagged in tech innovation, while companies like Apple, Google, and Tesla have reshaped global industries. Once the crown jewel of Japanese tech, Sony struggled for years to adapt to the digital revolution. Toshiba faced accounting scandals and experienced a loss of investor confidence. Other companies like Sharp had to be rescued by Taiwan's Foxconn in 2016. Meanwhile, newer fields like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and fintech saw little Japanese presence globally. Even in areas where Japan used to lead, like robotics and advanced manufacturing, the edge is fading. According to 2024 reports from Al Jazeera, over 30% of Japan's population was 65 or older. That figure is just 17% in the US and 21% in Germany. More alarmingly, Japan's working age population, those between 15 and 64, has steadily declined since the mid-1990s. In 1995, Japan had 87 million working age citizens. Today it's down to 74 million, which is falling fast. The fertility rate also tells a shocking story. Japan's birth rate fell to 1.20 children per woman as of 2023, far below the 2.1 needed to maintain a stable population. While the birth rate is declining, fewer couples are also getting married. More young people are choosing to remain single, as many cite the high living costs, long work hours, and general lack of childcare support as key reasons for avoiding parenthood. In 2024 alone, Japan recorded fewer than 72,988 births, making it the lowest since records began in the 19th century. At the same time, over 1.5 million people lost their lives, which means the country is losing its population at accelerating pace. Even when Japan launched the Specified Skilled Worker Program in 2019 to attract foreign workers in 14 key industries, it was designed for short-term stays. As of late 2023, the number of foreign workers in the country has risen slightly, crossing over 2 million, but that's nowhere near enough to fill the growing gaps in the workforce. This refusal to open the door wider is hitting Japan's economy hard. Fewer workers means fewer taxpayers, smaller consumer markets, and less innovation, as more than 8 million homes across Japan now sit empty. So what happens to a country that grows older, emptier, and more closed off by the year? Can Japan survive without a new generation to carry the weight of its past? Thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on Japan's crisis right now? Share in the comments, we'd love to hear what you think. If you learned something new today, hit the like button and subscribe. See you in the next video.